Hello everyone, in today's video I begin by rebuilding the 1/10 scale 3D printed Rallycross chassis I'm using for the Subaru, and I make some progress on the 3D printed Skyline build by adding some details to the body and assembling some of the suspension components. Today I'm starting by working on a car that I've featured several times before on this channel, the 2007 Subaru Impreza sitting on top of a custom all-wheel drive 3D printed chassis. The last time I featured this car, I discussed some of the upgrades that I wanted to make to the chassis to help improve its durability and performance. In that video, I completely tore down the chassis in preparation of installing a bunch of new parts. Here's a look at all the parts that I printed for this chassis. I integrated a lot of the changes and improvements that I talked about the last time I made a video on this project. I also purchased some off-road shocks, which I will be using instead of the touring car shocks that I was using before. I'll go into more detail about each component as I reassemble the chassis. I first started by assembling the half shafts. As I discussed before, the all-plastic one-piece half shafts were a weak point in the driveline. I split the design in half, giving the part a nice flat bottom surface, making printing easier. And I'm using steel dowel pins sandwiched between the two halves, which will be much stronger than the all-plastic design I used previously. To assemble the shafts, I first sanded each bottom surface to help the glue to adhere to each piece, and I used a little bit of shoe goo to secure the dowel pins, and finally I glued the top piece to the bottom with some fast-drying super glue. With all the shafts assembled, I moved on to working on the control arms. Instead of using a 3D printed ball joint, I'm using these smooth 10mm plastic spheres so that the joint will move much more smoothly than the 3D printed parts I was using before. The ball fits very well into the socket, however, there is a lot of play moving up and down. This isn't ideal, but I'm far less concerned about the up and down play than I am about the movement from front to back and side to side. Next, I test fitted the control arm mount. Because of how each half of the control arm is printed, it's hard to get the mount to fit perfectly due to the curvature, but when an appropriate amount of support structure is used, the fitment feels fine. Initially, when I designed the control arms, I intended to use small bolts and nuts to help secure each half and make sure that they are aligned properly. However, I feel that the bolts aren't necessary. What I'll probably do is design several places where small dowel pins can be inserted prior to gluing, which will help with alignment. Once I assembled all the upper control arms, I moved on to the lower ones. I designed several different versions which placed the lower shock mount in different areas. I assembled these the same way I did with the upper control arms. The upper control arms for the rear are a different design so that the rear knuckle cannot turn. At the time of filming, I didn't have the 4mm rods on hand that I will use to attach the rear knuckle to the upper control arm. Because of this, I did not fully assemble the rear suspension. Another part I didn't have on hand at the time were long enough machine screws to use for these steering arms. These screws hold each half of the steering arm together and secure the 5mm steel balls that fit into the tie rods. After press fitting one of the balls into the tie rod, I felt that the fit was a bit too snug, so I decided to reprint the tie rod pieces with a little larger tolerance so that the balls would move more freely. While the new parts were being printed, I started working on the knuckles. I started by removing each control arm from the old knuckle. The new knuckles, like with many new parts I designed, are two-piece. The halves are secured to each other using two M2 screws. After installing the screws, I then attach the new control arms to the knuckles. Next, I installed the front differential and pinion gear into the new housing. This new differential housing design is very similar to the old one, however, I strengthened a few places such as where the upper shock mount is secured, and I improved some of the tolerances so that the bearings fit better. And I modified the way that the control arm mount is secured, which you'll see a little later on. After the differential and pinion were installed and greased, I installed the top half of the housing and made sure everything rotates smoothly. After that, I installed all of the front suspension components. I'm now securing each control arm mount using one 40mm M3 bolt threaded into a nut on the back side of the housing. This new suspension feels great. It's a little bit tight, but it's fine for this application, and there is no plate, which is most important. Hopefully, even after some abusive driving, the suspension setup will continue to feel solid. I was anticipating that the shocks would mount using M3 fasteners, however, it turns out that it uses M2.5, so I'll need to reprint some new lower control arms with some smaller holes for the lower shock mount. I also wanted to get some ideas on how I wanted to design the upper shock mount, and roughly at what angle I want the shocks to be at. The new tie rods that I printed allowed the ball joints to move much easier, so I installed all the balls into the sockets. I then began disassembling the old rear suspension pieces and began assembling the new rear knuckles. After that, I installed the rear differential and pinion gear just like I did with the front. Although I've still got some work to do before I'm ready to fully assemble the suspension and install the new components onto the chassis, so far everything's coming together really well, and I look forward to seeing how everything performs once I'm able to test drive the car with these new parts. I've been able to make a little bit of progress on the Skyline build, which is a project that I've been showcasing regularly and gradually been making some progress on. I started by printing another set of wheels. These are a little bit smaller than the wheels that I had printed previously, since I felt that they looked just a little bit too big. However, I feel that these new wheels look just a tad bit too small, but they'll work. I decided to go ahead and paint both sets of wheels as well as the new rotors. The only black paint I had on hand to spray the wheels with was some thick Rust-Oleum paint, which left a lot of texture, especially since I didn't want to lay it on too thick. For now, I don't mind the orange peel, though at some point I may print out a new set and give them a proper paint job. I went ahead and did a little bit of sanding on the tires and mounted them to the wheels. After that, I did a little bit of sanding on the diffuser and splitter pieces, and I used some Testor's contour putty to fill in several sections and refine the shape of the parts. Once finished, I applied several coats of primer to each part and then painted them. Next, I installed the front and rear bumper to the body. To mount them, I cut some small strips of styrene, which I first glued to the body and then glued the bumpers to that styrene piece. Since the shoe goo was a bit slow drying, I used super glue to mount the rear bumper. I wanted to paint some details onto the body. I started by masking around the side windows where I wanted to paint black. I just did a quick masking job since, as I've mentioned before, I'm not interested in trying to make this car look perfect, and I really don't want to invest too much time or effort into this particular body. I'm currently working on getting a spray box and some lighting set up so I can have a nice permanent airbrushing setup indoors and be able to film the paintwork as well. But for now, I just used a little bit more of that Rust-Oleum from a spray can to paint these sections, which all things considered turned out pretty well. I did the same thing for the front and rear windows. The black paint around the windows really adds some nice detail to the body. I used a toothpick and a little bit of alcohol to clean up a few sections around the edge, and I used a brush to paint a few sections. Just these few details really helps give the body a little more of a scale appearance. I was also able to make a little bit of progress on the chassis. I started by printing all of the remaining suspension and drivetrain components. I then sanded all of the parts so that they fit, and I installed the wheel axles and half shafts onto the Knuckle. However, I later figured out that the wheel axles are just a few millimeters too short for the wheels that I'll be using, so I will need to reprint slightly longer ones for this car. That is where this build is right now. It's getting very close to being ready to be driven, which I'm definitely looking forward to. I think those few little paint details that I added to the body really helped the overall appearance. I still have to add the headlights, windows, hood, diffuser, splitter, and spoiler to the body. If there's anything else you want to see me add to the body, let me know. Currently, I'm in the process of acquiring some model kits for some upcoming projects and to showcase some products and chassis kits that I'll soon be selling. And this is one of the kits that I purchased. It's another monogram Firebird, though this time it's brand new. I figured since I spent a fair amount of time designing the parts that fit this specific kit, and I'm already familiar with it, I wanted to build another Firebird. This build is hopefully going to go a lot easier than the other one, since I don't need to tear down the car before getting started, all of the parts are already designed, and with the experience of the previous Firebird, I have a much better idea of what I'm doing. This build is going to be a little bit different though, as I'm not going to be building another drift car with this kit. All the parts seem pretty nicely designed and molded. I'm not sure how many of the detail parts I'll be using, being that this is going to be a functioning RC vehicle, but things I won't use like the tires and drivetrain components will look great in the scale shop. So there's a quick look at the monogram 1992 Pontiac Firebird Formula model kit. I look forward to getting started on this build, as well as continuing to work on the other Firebird, which I'm currently in the process of installing the new axle and working on the front suspension. I'll have more on that in a future video. As always, I want to show some of the amazing work you all have been showcasing over on the Make It RC Facebook group. I'm always impressed by the creativity and quality of the vehicles and projects. If you'd like to join the group, as always, the link is below in the description. One final thing before ending this video, I want to thank everyone who has been buying products from the Make It RC store. The support has been amazing, and I've got several new products that will be added very shortly, which is what you see here. The link to the store page is below in the description. Once again, thank you for the support, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.